Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a bit of a paleontological puzzle, the dinosaur Brachyceratops.
Yeah, it's a fascinating one.
We've gathered quite a bit of scientific info, looking at its discovery, how it fits in the family tree, and, well, this whole debate about whether it's even a valid genus.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to sort of unpack what we actually know about this short-horned face and maybe understand why it's still such an enigma.
It really is a great case study. It shows how science works, how understanding evolves with new evidence, new ways of looking at things. Brachyceratops is like a perfect snapshot of that process.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning. August 1913, Montana.
Right, the Two Medicine Formation, and specifically on the Blackfoot Indian Reservation.
That's where C.W. Gilmore and John Floyd Strayer made the first find, wasn't it?
That's right. Those were the bones that would become Brachyceratops. You have to remember, back then, finding any dinosaur was huge news. It was all still very new.
Gilmore officially named it, when was it? 1914.
Yes, 1914. And Brachyceratops, it's Greek, like you said, for short-horned face. Pretty straightforward.
And the species name, montanensis.
Just means from Montana. Tells you where it was found.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, I think. They didn't just find one skeleton neatly laid out.
No, far from it. It was quite jumbled.
Yeah.
Incomplete bones from 5 different individuals.
5, wow. And they were young ones, right? Estimated about 5 feet long.
Exactly, 5 juveniles, which immediately made people wonder. Maybe they were nestmates
Yeah.
or moving as a little group.
You can almost picture that, can't you? A little gang of young horned dinosaurs.
And that there were juveniles.
Yeah.
That's really the key point here. It affects everything that comes after.
So the main reference specimen, the holotype, that's USNM 7951, a partial skull.
That's the one. And then there are paratypes, other bits that help define it. A snout, USNM 7952. A partial skeleton with a skull, 7953. And even a foot, 7957.
All held at the Smithsonian, right?
Correct. All part of that initial find.
And Gilmore actually put together a skeletal reconstruction based on these bits and pieces.
He did, yeah. Published it in a monograph in 1917. Quite a challenge, trying to figure out the whole animal from fragments like that.
Definitely. But you mentioned this incompleteness and them being juveniles. That's led to it being called a dubious genus.
Precisely. A nomen dubium. A dubious name. Basically, it means the original material, the holotype, isn't distinctive enough to be sure it's different from other known dinosaurs or to confidently assign other fossils to it.
Especially because juvenile features can be so different from adult ones.
Exactly. Ontogeny, how an animal changes as it grows, is a huge factor. Things like horn shape, frill development, they change dramatically.
So are the features of Brachyceratops unique or just typical of a young centrosaurian? That's the question.
Okay, so let's dig into that dubious part more. Because they're young, we can't be sure the features aren't just Dobie features, things that change later. That's the core issue, and this suspicion has been around for a long, long time. The idea was maybe these Brachyceratops kids are just the young versions of some other known centrosaurian.
And monoclonius was often mentioned?
Yeah, monoclonius was a popular candidate for a while, another horned dinosaur found in similar aged rocks nearby.
So the idea was these little guys with short horns might grow up into something like monoclonius with its big single nasal horn.
It seemed plausible.
Yeah.
But then things got a bit more complicated. There was another specimen, USNM 20765.
Right.
Gilmore found this one too, actually, about a mile from the first site. It was a bit older, a sub-adult.
A teenager, basically.
Kind of, yeah. And for a long time, it was sort of lumped in. But by around 2011, studies started showing something different.
What did they show?
That this sub-adult specimen, USNM 14765, it wasn't Brachyceratops. It was actually a young Rubiasaurus ovatus.
Ah, Rubiasaurs. We talked about that one before. So what was the giveaway? How did they figure that out?
They found a specific shared feature, an apomorphy, something unique, that linked it directly to Rubiasaurus. Like a little anatomical signature that only Rubiasaurus and this subadult had.
Okay, so that specific bone told a different story.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It wasn't seen in other related dinosaurs, suggesting a direct link to Rubiasaurus. That reclassification was a pretty big deal.
Right, but
Yeah.
does that mean the original little baby Brachyceratops fossils are also just baby Rubiasaurus?
Well, that's where it gets tricky again. Not automatically, no.
Why not? If the slightly older one found nearby is Rubiasaurus.
Because those original juvenile specimens, the holotype and paratypes, they're still officially considered nomen dubium. They're just too incomplete, and the individuals were too young.
Too young to show that special Rubiasaurus feature.
Precisely. They hadn't developed those clear distinguishing characteristics, of those apomorphies that would let us say with certainty, yes, this is definitely a young Rubeosaurus or a young anything else for that matter.
So the link seems likely, maybe even probable, given the subadults, but we can't prove it from those first bones.
Exactly. The holotype just doesn't have the diagnostic features. And because of that, you can't declare Brachyceratops the senior synonym for Rubeosaurus.
Senior synonym, meaning the earlier name takes precedence.
Right. If we knew Brachyceratops was just young Rubeosaurus, the name Brachyceratops, published first, would technically replace Rubeosaurus. But we can't prove it from the type material.
Got it. So the name Brachyceratops stays, but kind of in limbo.
Pretty much. It's a name tied to fossils that are too ambiguous.
Okay, let's go back to what those original juvenile skulls did show. You mentioned small bumps over the eyes.
Yes, instead of proper brow horns like you see in adults, just little nubbins, really.
Mm-hmm.
The nasal horn on the snout was thicker but low, not very prominent.
And they had a frill, the neck shield.
They did, yeah.
Well,
a moderately large frill, which is typical for ceratopsians, but again, it's a catch.
let me guess. It was incomplete.
You got it. The frills weren't complete enough in any of the specimens to tell if they had those openings, the parietal fenestrae that you see in many centrosaurians.
Ah, so another missing piece of the puzzle. That makes it harder to compare them to, I bet.
Definitely. The frill structure is really important for telling different ceratopsians apart.
So classification-wise, we know it's in the Centrosaurin subfamily. That seems clear.
Yes, based on the general features, it fits within that group of mostly short-frilled, often ornately horned dinosaurs.
But pinning it down more precisely is the problem because they're juveniles.
That's the recurring theme. Scott Sampson and colleagues looked at it back in 1997. They basically concluded it had to be the juvenile form of a known centrosaurine.
But they couldn't say which one.
No. Because, as they pointed out, the features that really distinguish adult ceratopsians just weren't developed yet in the Brachyceratops material.
Mm-hmm.
So they kept it as nomen dubium.
Then later in 2007, Michael Ryan and others suggested it might be a young Styracosaurus ovatus.
They did. And Styracosaurus ovatus is now, of course, classified as Rubeosaurus ovatus.
Right, connecting back to the subadult specimen.
Exactly. And that 2011 study we mentioned, the one that reclassified the subadult as Rubeosaurus, that lent support to Ryan's idea, at least for that more mature specimen.
So the evidence is kind of pointing towards Rubeosaurus, but the original fossils themselves are still holding out on us.
That's a good way to put it. The circumstantial evidence points one way, but the direct evidence from the type specimen isn't conclusive.
It really is like a detective story, isn't it? Following the clues. Okay, let's zoom out a bit. What else was living alongside Brachyceratops back then in Late Cretaceous, Montana? What was the neighborhood like?
Oh, it was a busy place. The Two Medicine Formation has yielded a fantastic diversity of life.
Like who?
Well, you had other plant eaters. There was a small ornithopod called Orodromius, lots of hadrosaurids, the duck-billed dinosaurs.
Which ones?
Hypacrosaurus, Maiasaur, the famous good mother lizard, and Prosaurolophus.
And other horned dinosaurs, too, besides potentially Rubeosaurus.
Yeah, definitely. We know Stegosaurus and Inosaurus were around, so quite a few ceratopsians sharing the landscape.
A lot of competition for plants, maybe?
Could be. Then you had the armored dinosaurs, the ankylosaurs, things like Edmontonia and Euoplocephalus, walking tanks, basically.
And the predators, I assume there were some big ones.
Oh, yes. The main event was the Tyrannosaurid Daspildosaurus, a big predator, definitely capable of taking on ceratopsians. Some research suggests they might have even specialized in hunting them.
Oof. Not good news if you're a Brachyceratops. Especially a young one.
Definitely not. Adds a layer of danger to being 5 feet long with only horn bumps.
Were there smaller predators, too?
Yes, quite a few. We find fossils of things like Bambioraptor, which was a dromaeosaur, a raptor, also Chirostenotes, an oviraptorosaur, the famously brainy Trudon, and even early bird relatives like Avosaurus.
Wow. So a really rich, complex ecosystem.
Absolutely. Brachyceratops, whatever its adult form was, lived in a dynamic world.
Okay, let's try to wrap this up. We've covered a lot of ground on Brachyceratops. What are the absolute key things for you, the main takeaways?
I think the core points are Brachyceratops, the short-horned face, is only known for sure from these incomplete juvenile fossils found in Montana back in 1913.
Right. Intriguing find, but problematic from the start.
Exactly. Its classification is uncertain because the specimens are so young, the features just aren't fully developed.
And the plot twist is the reclassification of that slightly older specimen, USNM 15765.
Yes. Identifying that one as a young Rubeosaurus makes it very likely that the original Brachyceratops fossils are also young Rubeosaurus, or maybe another very closely related Centrosaurian.
But, and this is the big but,
The big but is that the original holotype specimen itself is too incomplete and immature to prove that connection based on unique features.
so officially Brachyceratops remains a nomen dubium, a dubious name.
That's where the science stands. We need clear diagnostic evidence from the type material itself to make a definitive link, and it just isn't there.
So, as we finish up this deep dive, maybe a final thought for you listening at home. Think about the challenges here. Paleontologists working with fragments, especially of young animals where features change so much.
Yeah, how much can you really know for sure when the evidence is like this? It's constantly evolving as we find more, or reanalyze old finds with new techniques.
What discovery could finally crack the Brachyceratops case? A nice adult skull found with some juveniles, more complete young ones.
That's what we hope for, something that bridges the gap definitively. Until then, the mystery of the short-horned face from Montana continues. It really shows how the story of the past is still being uncovered piece by piece.